Thanks for joining this session. We'll be concentrating now on how to move from vision, which I believe by now we're all well aligned, into action. And with that, I would like to hand over to Aruna to introduce the team.
Good day to everyone, those who are joining us here in Glasgow and those who are watching us live for this program. First of all, many thanks to Hitachi ABB for bringing us all together. And while this session is about vision to action, I would add another phrase to it. It's vision to action to scale. Because it's not just enough to get the projects on the ground or get enough electric capacity going across the world, but we also have to do it at scale across the world and with much greater urgency. I'm Arunabha Ghosh. I'm the CEO of an independent think tank based in New Delhi in India, but we work across several emerging markets. We're called the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. It's been a good week for us as we've been supporting the government of India with the net zero announcement and the scale up of clean energy targets. But today you will hear from leading experts in the energy field about what it will take to go from vision to action to accelerated scale. We have with us Mr. Jon Moore, who's currently the CEO of Bloomberg New Energy Finance after he led the firm's operations for 6 years. He has more than 20 years of experience of building professional services firms in the financial services industry. Prior to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, Jon spent a decade at JP Morgan, and before that he was also co-founder and CEO of a business consulting firm, MA Partners. We will also hear from Ms. Anna Borg, who's the president and CEO of Vattenfall. Since 2017, Anna Borg was Vattenfall's CFO and has many years of experience in the energy sector. Among other things, she has been Senior Vice President for Vattenfall's business area markets, led the Nordic sales business, the Swedish heat business, as well as the European B2C business. Anna Borg has deep and broad experience across the sector, and you will know why very soon. We also will hear from Cordy O'Hara, who is responsible for the development, financing, construction, and operation of large-scale energy assets. She is in charge of electricity interconnectors, LNG storage and regasification, onshore wind and solar generation, and competitive transmission. And before joining National Grid, Cordy was also the Chief Operating Officer of the US gas business for National Grid. Cordy, thank you for joining us. And last but obviously not the least, Claudio Fachin, who is the Senior Vice President and Executive Officer of Hitachi, and also the CEO of Hitachi Energy. He took up this present role just a few months ago after leading the power grids business between 2016 and 2020, and the power systems division of ABB from 2013 to 2015. So as you can see, we have the right actors on stage to tell us how to get there, but I'm going to start with you, Jon. There's been new research that BNEF has put out through the New Energy Outlook. What are the key findings that you see? What is lacking in vision? What is lacking in action? And what needs to happen for acceleration?
Okay, thank you, Arunabha. So every year we put out our New Energy Outlook, which is our 2050 forecast. Pretty much every year we've done an economic transition scenario, which basically means we look at what the numbers, what the economics tell us will happen. This last year we did 3 different climate scenarios. So looking at net zero 2050, 3 different technology routes. So one was our green scenario, looking at renewables and green hydrogen. One was our grey scenario, looking at gas, CCS, and alongside renewables. And a red scenario, so looking at nuclear for hydrogen, and also so red hydrogen and renewables. So just to give us a range, so these are pure signals. No one geography will take that pure path, but the idea was to give us the numbers that people could use as a benchmark. And we looked at a reduction of about 30% of emissions by 2030, and by 2040, 75%. And again, sort of a smooth transition. We made sure that there were no sort of, in our modeling, sort of extreme changes. And so what we found was, first off, really the scale of build out of renewables in all of those scenarios is dramatic. So the speed up we need, it's already cost effective in 2/3 of the world already, and what we really need is a massive upscaling. So wind by a factor of 5, so in terms of, from 2020, 5 times more wind per annum built out. Solar was about 3 times, and batteries 26 times. So a sort of massive scale up of those technologies. Alongside that, you would need to take out coal. So it's about 100 gigawatts per annum, so in parallel to the build out of renewables. And also a lot of R&D to bring down the costs of what we call phase 2 technologies. So actually hydrogen is one of those phase 2 technologies, so it's not cost effective now. CCS is one of those phase 2 technologies. So we didn't pick sides, we just said you have to invest now to bring those costs down. And then finally, in terms of overall numbers, it ranged between actually 90 trillion over 30 years and 170 trillion, quite wide. Mark Carney used the 100 trillion as a rounded number, so he's in range, so 100 trillion. And of that, about 22 to 24 was on the grid. So again, as you electrify, about a quarter of that 100 trillion is going to need to be spent on the grid to enable that level of electrification. So I suppose those were the key things that really need to be focused on over the next decade or so.
And before I come to Anna, just one follow-up. In this kind of range of red, blue, green scenarios, what's the most difficult challenge to leap from the red to the green?
So every geography will take its own path. Every geography starts off with its own energy mix.
Right.
So actually you need to do a geography by geography assessment of starting point, and you have three viable options. The question is, what mix of those options will you take? So it will be a blend. So actually what we're going to do in this year's New Energy Outlook is do a US version, we'll do an India version, we'll do a China version, and the answers will be different. In the US they're very gas-centric. So you start from a very different set of choices, let's say, much more nuclear in France or China or whatever. So it's not, these things will sort of run in parallel, if you like, and you'll end up with an optimum mix by country. Also, it will need to align with industrial strategy, because the industrial strategy of every nation is different. So it really needs buy-in at a country level to choose between those pathways.
So what, John, you've highlighted are sort of the moving variables of policy choice and energy choice at a country level or regional level, but then those same choices apply at a company level. So Anna, I'm going to turn to you. Vattenfall's vision is to get to fossil-free living within 1 generation. So what are the critical strategic choices you're making and the initiatives you've already launched that are accelerating our way to that destination?
Well, I can very much relate to the scenarios that you are describing, because we are already living in a mix of them and they are sort of unfolding as we go along. But a number of years ago, we set out the ambition at Vattenfall to enable a fossil-free living. And to us, that is, it's not our sustainability strategy, it's our business strategy. And to me, that's a big difference. So this is what we're going to build our business on going forward. And over the last couple of years, we have dramatically transformed our asset portfolio. We are phasing out coal, we're phasing out gas, and we're investing basically all our growth money into fossil-free energy. And we're today one of the main offshore wind developers in Europe. So to me, this is, the path for our business to be successful and competitive in the future. We have also set very clear targets. We have committed to the 1.5 degree trajectory in the Paris Agreement and to be net zero by 2040. And that applies to our own operations, of course, but it also applies to everything that we buy from our suppliers and the products and services that we offer to our customers. And to me, I think that, we tend to underestimate the risk of remaining in the current business models. Because there's a lot of discussion around, so how are we going to transform and what's the risk of that and how much more will this new technology cost? I actually think that it will be much more of a risk to remain in the existing business models. The customer demand will change so much faster than the industrial processes. So if you want to be competitive in the future, you need to move, and you need to move now.
That's a very interesting perspective. So I want to again come back to you. Are you then suggesting that customer demand will drive the speed at which these strategic decisions are taken, or is it also possible for businesses to kind of make a completely different offering to customers who've maybe not internalized the scale of the challenge yet? Now, is it the supply push or the demand pull?
I think it will actually be a combination, and we see that already today. I'll give you a couple of examples. I mean, we have cooperated since a few years together with LKAB, the mining company, and SSAB, the steel company, to produce fossil-free steel.
That's right.
And in the beginning, there was a discussion around so who is going to buy this steel and how much more is it going to cost than traditional steel? Is the characteristics going to be good enough, etc.? And the technical problems are solved. The steel is just as good as any traditional steel. The steel that is produced, because we have actually produced, or SSAB has produced the fossil-free steel, and that is actually sold. It's sold to Volvo AB, so they are using it today. And there is a queue, a lineup of customers who want to buy this steel. And this has happened in a very few years. So now it's about scaling up and commercializing this faster rather than anything else. And I think this is one example of how important it is and will be to look at the new value chains end to end rather than looking at them piece by piece and the way they used to look. But if you look at the total value chain and try to find the new solutions, then I think the answers will be more clear.
Yesterday at a similar discussion we were having on green hydrogen and where the demand would come from and where the technology would get pushed, the metaphor I used was that of a multi-pedal cycle where all of us, you see it in theme parks, everyone sits around and everyone's got a pedal for the whole contraption to move. But it seems to me that combination of what LKAB, SSAB and Vattenfall has done is a real example of that unfolding in reality. All right, let's turn to you, Corey, from the National Grid Ventures. You've been a voice for ambitious and accelerated action towards clean energy. What are the key initiatives you are taking? And even more so, what are the key initiatives that you wish you could be taking?
Thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be here today. And I do want to say that we are very ambitious for change, and I think everybody here on this panel is too. And actually being a principal partner at COP26 is a real opportunity to bring people together and convene these discussions, so I really appreciate being here. We really believe net zero is achievable by 2050, and we believe that as a set of collaboration efforts together, we can get there. The ambition's already a lot higher than it ever was, both nationally and now internationally. The UK power system itself, where we are the transmission system owner and operator, is going to be, carbon-free by 2035, and a significant amount of offshore wind generation will be delivered by 2030, an additional 30 gigawatts to 40. Our role in National Grid in the UK is to make sure that we're enabling the infrastructure that can allow this clean, resilient grid to be delivered. Onshore enablement is absolutely critical. Understanding how much offshore wind is going to connect, where it will connect, and then working with the communities and our regulator to make sure that infrastructure is there in time. In my business, we are an interconnectors business, and we see a very strong future for subsea electricity interconnection with this massive wind agenda. We currently have 5 electricity subsea interconnectors operational today. In fact, we're really excited in the last month to have delivered our North Sea Link, which is the largest in the world, with our partner Statnett connecting Norway to the UK, 723 kilometres long, and now able to share 1.4 gigawatts of clean energy between the respective countries. By 2023, we'll have delivered a Danish link with a similar size, and we also have links with both Belgium, the Netherlands, and 2 with France. So how do you deliver this next phase of offshore wind? Really, the days of point-to-point interconnection and single radial connection to farms is not going to be a viable option for the future. And so we've seen the deployment of our interconnector business as the first phase of a more integrated and meshed offshore grid. The second phase we see, which we're entering now in this critical decade, is multi-purpose or hybrid interconnection. Take the existing planned wind farms and actually allow multiple farms to connect to one interconnector and be able to export and share those resources between 2 different countries. That's going to have the benefit of less cabling, less infrastructure, less impact on coastal communities, and then this ability to manage both surpluses when the wind blows high and intermittency and deficits between countries when it's low. And then the final stage we see is having a fully meshed grids where we will see energy islands. We will see wind farms combined with new technologies, electrolysis for green hydrogen capture, and then this ability to manage a stable, resilient grid in the future.
Clearly you have a plan of tapping into that $20 trillion part of that $100 trillion story. But then let me try and get Claudio in. When you hear all of this playing out from Hitachi Energy perspective, what are the technology bets that you are taking then for driving that acceleration?
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I'll start with the last couple of points. One is that, first of all, we don't have the luxury to be selective on technology that is today available and can help support decarbonizing. So we need to go through the whole portfolio of technologies that are available today. And in that sense, of course, a lot of what Cordy was sharing, HVDC, so high voltage direct current technology that has been introduced by us some 60 plus years ago, has the maturity to take now the next step and become an overlaying DC grid to the existing AC. But what is important, what Cordy was also mentioning, and Anna, you also touched on that, is we have to look at this holistically. When you look at the future of the energy system, I think we're all aligned that it needs to be much more electrical. So electricity being the backbone, we will have to invest across the value chain, starting from, of course, more renewables to generate clean energy, but then transmitting, distributing, and then consuming it also with much higher levels of efficiency, but also consuming it in a different way, because we have to electrify transportation. We have to electrify demand on industry. As part of that, we also need to look at, and I really like the approach that BNEF is taking, at while we all agree where we need to be, carbon neutral, maybe the timeline is a bit different depending on which part of the world you are, but it is clear that we're all targeting at the same goal. The starting point is different. And what Jon was explaining is that then this different scenario approach allows you to draw a roadmap on how to, if I start from gray, green, or red, and then achieving that means adjusting. But it also means, once again, leveraging all the technologies that are today available, whether it's interconnections or storage at the edge, and of course, more and more, and here I think we still have a lot of potential, is to leverage digital technology in order to help managing the much higher complexity that we have in the system today and certainly going forward. Because some of the aspects that were mentioned in terms of variability, in terms of unpredictability of some of these resources can be dealt with, but it requires also some more innovation other than technology so that we can implement that technology, digital being one example, at the speed, at the pace, at the scale that is required.
So actually, let me pose a question again to both of you, Cody and Claudio, because Cody, you used the phrase, and you quickly kind of moved on because the rest of it was building on it, resilient grid. But not all grids are resilient, even in the best of, or the largest of economies. So, of course, the four of you know what you're talking about. But suppose you met with a new energy minister in an emerging economy who wants to do the right thing, is not technically proficient, and just says, I get this whole story around offshore wind and the interconnectors, and I get the digital innovations you're proposing, Claudio, but I've got a very unstable grid onshore right now, and I need to make sure that that is working fine, otherwise I'll lose my elections, and the finance minister is not going to give me extra money in the budget to do whatever you're proposing. What's your response to them?
Shall I start? We can't build out a renewable energy system without having a lot of flexibility. So, we've learned a lot in the transition in the UK alone. The UK has made phenomenal transition. In April this year, the energy mix, 80% was from renewable sources. The average over the year, 55%. Mm-hmm. So we've already got a significant penetration on the system, but that didn't come without investment in additional flexibility. Mm-hmm. And that's where you've got to be thinking about battery storage, demand side response. Yep. As you bring more wind onto the system, you get more intermittency and also more surpluses, and therefore you need a different level of energy storage to take advantage of those surpluses and to manage any intermittency and dips, and that's where hydrogen is becoming a partner technology. And then of course, as you build out these flexible resources, lots of data is mm-hmm. needed by the system operator mm-hmm. to understand when will the energy come, what flexibility resources will need to be deployed, and how can I do that in a really cost-efficient way. And so that's when the data and the digitalization comes in, because you will have a lot of choices and you will want to be cost effective, but that means having seamless understanding of the merit order of those resources, mm-hmm. the price and the market signals for that. Mm-hmm. And if you've got a lot of demand side flexibility and consumers are changing the way they use electricity mm-hmm. to support the system, their data needs to be protected and they need to trust Indeed. You. Indeed. So that brings a digital and cyber agenda mm-hmm. into the mix in the future.
Claudio?
Yeah, maybe just compliment. Just yesterday I had the pleasure also to have a similar panel. It was focusing on financing and how do we get financing for this clean energy transition into emerging markets. So we had the energy minister of Indonesia. And that's a great example on Indonesia from a geography standpoint. It's a quite complex structure, right? You have 17,000 plus islands. But you also have consumption points far from where the generation points are. And so you need all of those technologies that we were mentioning before. You need to build a backbone. You need interconnection between the major islands. But then you also need to find economical, affordable, but also resilience and reliability need to be part of that when you provide renewable energy in the smaller islands with microgrids and storage technology. But instead of consuming diesel, then you should leverage the local renewable resources, whether it is wind, solar, or also geothermal in this case. And what I think we have to do now to move from the vision to the action, and Indonesia has taken that task very concretely, They use the system value framework that we have created as a team out of a joint effort with the World Economic Forum that allows you to look at all the building blocks and looks at who needs to be the recipient, whether it's the end user, the private, the public, government, and how to then deploy all those elements, including, of course, making sure that it is attractive from a policy standpoint, from a regulation standpoint, in order to get the financing that is needed. And they have walked through that in a quite structured way. And I think that's the first step, to have more than just a vision, but a clear roadmap, building block by building block, in order then to be more concrete and take the next step and break down what is a real large, complex challenge into smaller ones that then the different stakeholders can tackle in a faster and more efficient way.
That need for a roadmap is indeed, what's going to play out very differently, again, economy by economy. So I am right now playing a double role of moderator, but I'm supposed to also tell you a little bit of a story of how it's unfolding in India. And as you have probably heard, India declared a net zero target for 2070 earlier this week, but also ramped up its near-term targets for 2030 for 500 gigawatts of non-fossil energy. About 450 of that would be renewables. Now, let's put that in perspective first. Our entire electricity system is 388 gigawatts. So we are not trying to shave things at the margin or as a share. We're basically saying we're going to upend the entire electricity system and build more renewables than we have as our entire electricity capacity today. Now, that sounds great and ambitious. What would it entail? One, as I said, the acceleration. So simple back of the envelope calculations will tell you that for the next 9 years, every working hour, India has to deploy 10.5 megawatts of renewables. So the hour that we spend here learning from you, someone out there should have deployed another 10.5 megawatts. Now, 11 years ago, when I started up CEW and the solar mission also began, the problem was that it used to take a lot longer to deploy a renewable energy project rather than connect it to the grid, because the grid existed and renewable energy was the marginal player. Now, with the rapid acceleration in what's happening with renewables, you can now deploy a large-scale renewable energy plant in, say, 8 or 9 months, unlike the 18 months it used to take, and the grid has to play catch-up. Now, what's the roadmap for that? India and countries like India are going to go through double leapfrogs. One is a leapfrog from the absence of energy altogether to access to energy. And the other leapfrog is from moving away from clean energy, dirty energy to clean energy. So since about 2017, when the household connections began, within 18 months, about 28 million households were connected. So that required one kind of building out the grid infrastructure where it was missing. But simultaneously, we also had what are called green energy corridors. So if you're generating power, solar in the west of the country, in the desert state, you've got an energy corridor there. Wind down south, you have an energy corridor there. The challenge is that now with this acceleration, we can't have a dedicated green energy corridor. Every energy corridor has to be a green energy corridor, because only then you would be able to tap into every potential source, onshore or offshore. The last thing in that roadmap will be similar to what you've been describing, Cordy, and what the Prime Minister announced earlier this week, the One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative. Just like you've connected up with Norway and then Denmark, we'll have to do the same in South and Southeast Asia and West Asia and tap into the solar, wind, offshore, onshore potential. and that will require its own resource planning. And that's just getting us to 2030. And the net zero modeling we have done means in 2070, India will need 5,600 gigawatts of solar. And if hydrogen did not scale up, that would mean 7,500 gigawatts of solar. So it's an exponential, breathless marathon for the rest of the half century that we are on. But that's just the perspective of one country. So let me get back to you, Jon. When you see this, what concerns you? Is it that countries are perhaps not thinking through these roadmaps in the way Cordy has described or Claudio is implementing, or is it that the roadmaps can be created, the money is not going to flow very quickly?
I mean, I think it's a bit of some of all of that. I mean, not everywhere, people are only just now putting together roadmaps on a country basis that actually really make sense. I mean, we've just got to the sort of end of the beginning in terms of commitments. So the amazing thing is the sort of end point, the net zero is becoming clear, and that's pretty definitive in terms of driving plans and driving investment. So the good news is those net zero plans will be clear in terms of goal, and I think that will attract in a lot of money. So again, in terms of the investment community, we heard from GFANZ yesterday, the announcements. Much of the investment community is also buying into having portfolios that are aligned with Paris. So now we need the plans, the implementation plans that they can fund. So actually, having looked at this prior, it's actually not the problem of the money, it's actually been the problem of what to fund. Are there enough projects out there? Because there's actually got to build these things. You actually get them permissioned. You actually have to get everything moving. These are whole new industries in some ways, and whole new supply chains. So I think that's probably the thing that needs to happen next, is really identify multiple projects that can be built out in different geographies of different natures. As we've said, it's going to be a combination of a number of technologies in a number of geographies. And then I think connecting that to foreign direct investment will be really what happens over the next, hopefully, 2 to 3 years to accelerate things.
So, and I'm going to deliberately play a bit of a devil's advocate to what Jon is saying, not because I disagree with him, but the who moves first becomes a question here. What Jon has described is rightly so. You have the right policy signal, you have the right regulatory architecture, you have the right technical roadmap, the money will come in. Often the world is not perfect. And yet emerging economies will drive 88% of new electricity demand over the next 2 decades. So should you wait for that perfect combination of policy, regulation, and guarantees for foreign investors, or should you say, regardless, there's still a massive new growth market there? And how do you balance the two?
Well, I think if you're going to wait for that moment, you're going to have to wait forever. And several things are actually happening at the same time. All of the things you describe are, of course, important to create the prerequisites for the development needed. But I feel and hear that a lot of the things being discussed now between different kind of companies and business partners is actually the business opportunities in this development. So I don't think that there is a need to wait, and I also think it will hurt your competitiveness to wait. So I see a lot of these business models emerging already today, and that's also how we will really have this push forward, I think. I participated before I came here today in an event where there was a launch of something called the First Movers Coalition.
Yes.
Started by Secretary John Kerry and the World Economic Forum, and that is about bridging the gap between supply and demand of these new technologies and make sure the time period between piloting and full commercialization is actually shorter than what it would otherwise be. But again, I'm quite sure that the movement we see now means that the customer demand will change much faster than we think. So the challenge will rather be how to transform your business fast enough in order to meet the demand that is there, rather than sitting back and waiting for something to happen. That will harm your competitiveness.
And you've clearly reinforced that point now twice about this, don't wait around and respond to this rapidly changing customer demand. Cody, I want you to tell us a little bit about, these, in the similar vein of messy markets, where, and I'm going to pose that question back again at you, the absence of resilient grids, etc. Give us some examples of where, through your prior experience, where there have been struggles with, making sure that the investment is going into the transmission infrastructure, and because it's not gone in, there are collapses, etc. How do you overcome? Because ultimately you are a service provider, and if that customer is missing, if the customer is not thinking long enough, if the customer is not putting the investment, what do you do to move the market in that direction, to which then you can respond?
Yeah, so I've been very fortunate to never see a grid collapse. And we do have a tremendously resilient grid here in the UK, which we operate, and we are the electricity system operator. But we have been exploring how do you really accelerate the ability to deploy the infrastructure that's needed. If communities really are struggling with the visual amenity and impact, and are there better ways to really get behind this clean energy transition? Because if we all agree on the end goal, which is a clean, green and resilient grid, fresh air that will survive us for many generations, we may have to make some compromises to get there in how we route the infrastructure, the nature, scale and size of that infrastructure. We've been very conscious of trying to make sure it's as least impact as possible. And that's why I do come back to the hybrid interconnector story I laid out earlier, because coastal communities need to see a benefit from a lot of infrastructure coming their way because of the scale of offshore wind. And actually, it's responsible to try and work together with the energy islands that will be developed, with the offshore wind developers, to then say, how can we minimize the connection points? How can we still give the communities the benefit of clean electricity with lower disruption? And actually, if we're actually combining assets, we're reducing the cost, as well. And the consumer narrative needs to be there as well. Do you want this? Do you want to change the behavior in how you consume electricity? Because that can avoid some of the upgrades in the systems as well, because actually they can provide relief from a system that could be constrained in a certain area if we're willing to change our consumption patterns. So I think there's a bit of how do we create the flexibility that avoids the need, and also how do we combine infrastructure to lessen the impact. And then on the regulatory side, we've advocated for anticipatory investment, because build and it will come. We know this is coming.
Yes.
And so actually, and we've seen this actually in New York, where we are deploying transmission there. The New York State has seen that additional transmission will be needed to unlock renewable energy that will connect. And we're starting to see that as a really a viable set of actions, that anticipatory transmission with a goal to unlock new renewables that will connect soon, it is a smart thing to do, to make sure nothing is constrained off the network.
So Claudio, another bit of a twist of a question. We've been talking so much about the grid and the transmission infrastructure that's necessary, and yet there are many geographies around the world that don't have energy, but also are not ideal for large-scale grid infrastructure. What's the vision at Hitachi Energy to think through this balance of the grid connected and the distributed generation and consumption. The more digital the infrastructure, more you can perhaps have more distributed generation, but that then undermines your business model. So for large continents where this might be a strategic question, what's your response?
I'd say, I'll go back to, we have a portfolio of technologies that go from looking at the edge, how to provide that electricity in a reliable, clean way, with microgrid technology, storage, and of course control systems that allow you to do a demand response. On the other end, you have the backbones, the interconnectors, the bring in bulk renewables from long distances. Offshore would be one of those. Many countries have 2,000, 3,000 kilometers worth of HVDC connections, precisely to connect generation with large demand on the consumption side. We have to somehow adopt what Jon is proposing. We have to accept that we have different starting points. And in some cases, we have the opportunity to jump some of the steps that we have taken in more mature economies and in more mature markets, because technology available today allows you to do so. For instance, to provide electricity to still the hundreds of millions of people that do not have access to electricity, definitely the grid edge technology is the first step. And there is enough innovation at that end that also allows, with the right policies behind, to make those investments attractive. By the way, India is one of those that have leveraged quite a bit on giving rural electrification priority. On the other end, at a certain point in time, when you reach a certain maturity, and I would see this even for Africa as a continent, once we have taken that step, and I believe that step needs to be taken, you then look at, from a continent standpoint, and to take the next step in terms of efficiency, competitiveness, reliability, resilience of that infrastructure, then you start thinking about larger investments, interconnecting the countries within a continent. And one example is just something that was recently announced. We're very pleased to be partnering in executing the first large HVDC interconnection between countries, and I would say even between continents, between Saudi Arabia and Egypt, with HVDC technology, multi-terminal, that was also deployed in other parts of the world. So allowing also to cross-fertilize and learn on how those experiences, to go back to the different scenarios, and then eventually take the right steps to first start with what really has direct impact, and then plan for the next stage, plan for the phase 2 of technologies that Jon was mentioning, whether it's hydrogen, carbon capture, but plan now. Right. So that everyone throughout the value chain will then be able to start making sure that we need to do our job, continue to innovate, make hydrogen and other technologies more competitive, drive efficiency in terms of how to deploy this technology, sharing those technologies across all stakeholders so that everyone can then contribute. And one thing is clear, I think we mentioned this many times in these different sessions, we can't deal with this on our own. We have to accept that going forward to deliver these ambitious plans, we have to open up and accept that someone else might be better than us in doing parts of that value chain, and then design our business models so that we allow for that. Right. There is no way for us to get on time without accepting that everyone can contribute, as long as the go-to point is very clear, and that needs to be carbon neutrality.
Jon, you've been itching to say something.
Can I add a sort of slightly different dimension, just to build on what Claudio has said, is about education. I mean, these markets have been moving very, very, very quickly. So there is, a lot of people in very responsible and powerful positions around the globe for whom this hasn't really happened in their geography yet. So, I mean, one of the things that we started to do in, say, Southeast Asia was, we called it the BNEF Academy. It was actually getting executives in existing energy businesses and really explaining how cheap technologies are and what the different components are and how they would fit together and how they would work together in a system. Because there are just, these technologies didn't exist when people were educated and they've not been rolled out at scale in many, many geographies. So I think there's also an education aspect that what we need to do is make sure that existing, many businesses, state-owned enterprises, so it's not just the markets will determine it. These are governments and state-owned companies that really need to be educated in what's possible. And then they too can play, the opportunity game, investing in, essentially what is going to be modern technology.
If I could jump in on that as well, thank you, because we're seeing it just as a responsible business, trying to engage more broadly consumers on this, energy transition is going to be so critical. And there actually is a lot more engagement than you realise if you make it more accessible. And we're just trialling something at the moment, which is an app. So if anybody in the audience, it's free if you want to download it, when to plug in. And actually what we've created is, it's for the UK only, I'm afraid, at this point, but it allows you to put in, your postcode or the region where you live. And it shows you the energy intensity, the carbon intensity of the region. And it tells you when is the cheapest time, or the greenest time, should I say, the greenest time to plug in. Whether that's, your tumble dryer, if you've got an electric vehicle. And what it's seeking to do is just create that different level of awareness. Because it's phenomenal. 1 million tumble dryers going on at the lowest, the lowest carbon intensity electricity that day can save 100,000 tons of CO2. I mean, so actually, we're all about the sort of education aspect to it. And even though we don't directly supply to consumers in the UK, we see that there's a responsibility for all of us in the industry to sort of bring greater awareness and connection to it.
Anna, yes.
Yeah, I actually think that all the examples here, are good examples of a lot of things coinciding right now, which I think will drive this development even further.
Right.
So it's the ambition, the increased ambitions and targets that you discussed, but it's also the technology development and the fact that the technology is becoming less expensive compared to what it used to be and is sort of picking up pace and competitiveness on its own merits. It's also the pricing of carbon that we see in several parts of the world, and I think that in Europe at least, that pricing of carbon has played a very important role when it comes to shifting the relative competitiveness between technologies, but also spark innovation around new sustainable technologies. And then we have the customer demand that we discussed, but we also have the financial markets. And I think we see more and more clearly that the financial markets are starting to regard anything that is a fossil business model as a higher risk. And then something starts to happen for real. So what are you going to use the money for is the first question these days. And if it's anything that is not sustainable or fossil free, you will either not get financing or it will cost you more. So you see several examples of green bonds or other kind of credit facilities where the financing is connected to fulfilling your environmental targets. And when all of this is happening at the same time, then this sort of picks up its own momentum and will only increase in speed, I think.
We are right at the top of the hour, and that's such a great comment to end on, Anna, because often what happens is either you have a technology that exists and then the policy hasn't caught up with the idea of that technology, or the policy and the technology exists but the customer isn't ready for it. And that's what results in what I call a schizophrenia between the same entity or the same person as a citizen and an economic agent, right? And the decisions you're trying to take as a responsible citizen might not be the same decisions you take as someone looking at fulfilling your shareholder value obligations. But when all of this begins to come together, the schizophrenia actually begins to disappear, because there are different things working simultaneously. And we need different things to work simultaneously in order to get to the scale at the pace that we need to get to net zero, be resilient, have access, reach the people who haven't been reached ever before, but also help to grow the biggest of economies better in a more sustainable manner. Victor Hugo said there's no power that can stop an idea whose time has come. Seems like the idea's time has come. Let's just move to action. Thank you so much for listening in.
Thank you.